what an honor to speak before young people who have chosen to embark upon such a noble profession, such a noble path. Thank you, Dean Coleman. Thank you, Dean Vaughn. Thank you, dedicated faculty and staff. Good afternoon, overjoyed and relieved parents and family. And congratulations to my fellow graduates. I say fellow graduates because, believe it or not, I am truly graduating with you. I'm graduating from a parallel journey that I began when you began your education. And when I say education, I do not mean just BU. I mean grade school. Because it was when you were just learning multiplication tables, believe it or not, and it's hard for me to say this, but it was when you were just learning your multiplication tables that I began working on a book. It took me 15 years to write this book. If it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. When I began it, I have to say that I had never written a book before. I'd been a journalist for several years and had won a Pulitzer Prize, but I'd never written a book before, and this is a totally different thing. I didn't know where it would lead or how long it would take. It was nonfiction, which meant that I needed to find real people through whom to tell a massive, massive story, one of the great underreported stories of the 20th century. I didn't know if I'd be able to find the protagonists necessary to tell the story, or if the people would be willing to talk with me, or if I could actually pull it off. I had no idea what I was in for. It's a good thing I didn't know it would take 15 years because I don't think I would have started it. Just the thought, the embodiment of looking out at you is a reminder of how long it took. You were about this tall when I began. In a way, I was jumping off a cliff into the unknown and risking, it seemed, pretty much everything. There were no guarantees of success, which is really the definition of life to begin with, isn't it? But something inside of me said I just had to tell this story. I had to write this book, no matter what it took. And what was the story that I felt I just had to tell? It was about people jumping off a cliff just as I was, and just as you are about to do. Only they were doing this under circumstances that are almost unimaginable to us today. These were people who were stuck in a caste system in the American South, an artificial and violent hierarchy that made it illegal, believe it or not, for a black person and a white person merely to play checkers together. That made it, it actually required black Bibles and white Bibles to swear to tell the truth on in court. These are the sacred scriptures themselves, and blacks and whites could not touch the same object. This was a caste system that made it illegal for, believe it or not, for a black motorist to pass a white motorist on the road, no matter how slowly that person was going. And whenever I tell people about that, that alone could probably account for a good several million people just saying, that I cannot take. These people ended up having to leave the only place they had ever known for a place that they had never seen in hopes that life might be better. There were 6 million of them who did this. They left the South for the North and for the West from World War I until the 1970s. That's 3 generations, most of the 20th century. And what they did would become called the Great Migration. It was the largest internal migration within our country's history, and it changed it forever. It was the only time that American citizens have been forced to defect from one part of their own country to be recognized as the citizens that they had been born to. They were in some ways seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. And yet it was a universal and classic American story. Ultimately, they were doing what the forebears of most Americans, all Americans truly, they were leaving the only place they'd ever known, which is really the American classic story. Someone in all of our backgrounds had to do what these people did just for us to be here, on this soil, in this space today. How many of us know or are descended from a great-grandmother from Ireland who came to America and met a great-grandfather from Italy, or from Russia, or from Poland, or from Germany, or Scandinavia, Latvia, Lithuania, or China, or from what other part of the world immigrants came from to get to this land, and started whole new lineages, meaning that many of us might not even exist as we are today had these people not made this great leap of faith to come to this country, cross the oceans in order to get here. They left us a lesson of how to live as a result of what they did, because someone had to jump off a cliff into the unknown for us to even be here. I was so determined to tell this story that I actually recreated the journey of several of the people that I wrote about. There are 3 people. Each of them represent a different decade, different part of the country that they left, and a different outcome. And so one of them, I wanted to recreate his journey. And this was a person who was a surgeon in the Army. He'd been a captain in the Army during the Korean conflict. But after he got out of the war, it turned out he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. And so he set out on a course to get from Louisiana to California, but he had miscalculated the extent of the arm of the caste system known as Jim Crow. And it turned out he could not stop for 3 of the massive states of the West. These states are the size, I mean, Texas is a country unto itself. And many of these states are bigger than the entire New England region. And so this was a very long way he had to go without being able to rest. He could not find a place that would allow him a room to rest for the night. And so I decided to do the same thing. I rented a Buick as he had. And he said, if you'd seen his Buick, you would have wanted it too. I had my parents with me who were part of this great migration. My mother was from Rome, Georgia, and my father was from Petersburg, Virginia. And they met in Washington, D.C., and I'm one of these people who, like the majority of African Americans that you might meet in the North and the Midwest and the West, and the majority of Americans on the whole, who literally wouldn't exist if their parents hadn't met because they migrated from some place far away. They would simply not have met. But in any case, they were retired and they were willing to go on this journey with me in this Buick across the country. And so we set out on a course for it, and when we got to the part where the land changes dramatically, you're now in the desert. You're in the mountains, and the mountains require hairpin curves, and the road begins to get mean and unpredictable, and you begin to go north and south as much as west, and it's very hard to predict what the road is going to do. It's total and complete darkness. There is a great distance between the settlements, so you have no way of knowing truly how far you've gone. No other cars on the road, and you feel completely alone. This is what he had to go through in order to get to California. I had my parents with me, and we were many, many decades from the time that he had done this. He had done this in 1953. This was now in the 90s when I did this. Trying to figure out where you all would have been, maybe in junior high school or middle school at that point. But in any case, so there we were, and my parents began to fear for us all, because I wanted to recreate what it was like to feel to get so tired and so weary from driving for so long that your hands begin to lock in place because you've been gripping the wheel for so long, and your eyes begin to ache from the weariness of lack of sleep. I wanted to know what he had gone through. I wanted to experience it for myself. This is a kind of thing that takes a level of dedication that maybe doesn't even make sense, but I felt that I needed to do it in order to be true to the work. So anyway, we were in this area where it was darkness, the road was mean, I couldn't see, and I was falling asleep and driving off the road. And my parents said, you have to stop the car. I know you want to do this thing, but you really need to stop the car. And if you don't want to stop the car, let us out. And so with a mutiny on my hands, I decided to go ahead and do what my parents said, even though it meant that I was going to have to veer from the methodology that I'd so carefully scripted for myself. And because this was no longer 1953, and we have come so very, very far as a country, we have a long way to go, but we've come so very far, we had no trouble finding a place to rest for the night. And it actually made me feel even more empathy for what this individual, 1 out of 6 million, had to go through in order to find freedom within his own country. So what are we to learn from all of this? What are the lessons of people who migrated so far away, jumping off a cliff into the unknown, as had to have occurred in all of our backgrounds just for us to be here? It turns out that when people do such a thing, they're not often doing it for themselves, they're doing it for the children. They're doing it for the unseen grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There are people who made this sacrifice so that decades later, there would be a large number of young people sitting in rows in red robes about to get their degree from Boston University. They're not with us here in person, clearly, but they're with us in spirit, and they're in our bodies, and they're in our souls, because they made a sacrifice that made it possible for us to all be here. Now, in this migration that I've written about, the end result was often very famous people that we often take for granted, whole aspects of American culture that exist because of the individual decisions of these people who did not make the decision with the idea of changing the world, but ultimately did so by their actions. These are the forebears of people like Toni Morrison, who simply would not have been able to become the Nobel laureate that she became had her parents not migrated from Alabama to Ohio. Now, when she was growing up, it was not possible for an African American to merely take out a library book. But by simply leaving, her parents gave her the opportunity, the option, to be able to take out a library book, get access to books. And you know, if you're going to become a Nobel laureate, you kind of need to be able to get a book now and then. You know, it helps. Also, these are the people who were the children, these are the children of the migration who made so many other contributions to our culture. The playwright August Wilson, almost all of his works were dedicated to understanding the Great Migration. Bill Russell, the NBA great, simply would not have ever made it to the Celtics. Simply wouldn't have, had his parents not migrated from Monroe, Louisiana to California, where he got the opportunity to go to a college, an NCAA college, and where he had a chance to actually lead his school to 2 NCAA championships. Had his parents stayed in Monroe, Louisiana, he very likely would have ended up working in a sawmill, and we would never know his name. It's inconceivable to Bostonians and to any people who follow professional sports that Bill Russell would not be a part of American history. It's unimaginable, and yet that almost happened had his parents not made this journey. Other people that were part of this were people like Prince and Michael Jackson and Jay-Z and P. Diddy and Michelle Obama and Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk. So many people who very likely would not have become the people that they were, would not even know their names, had their forebears not made this great leap of faith. Whole aspects of American culture simply would not exist. From Motown to jazz would not have existed. So that means that an individual can have tremendous power, so much more power than we often think of. The power to actually change a country, the power to force the South, a region that had been mired and fixed in a feudal system, actually changed as a result of the decisions of these individual people. It shows you the power of the individual human heart and the power of the immigrant spirit, which has propelled all of us ultimately to where we are. By the actions of these people, whether they left Italy, China, or Alabama, they have left us a code of survival, left us with answers to many of the questions that we might have as to what we should do and the directions we should take. There are stories of great heroism and courage in all of our backgrounds, which we should embrace, listen to, cherish, and record, so that we can not always look to others to solve our problems, but realize that we have it within us, not just within us as individuals, but within our backgrounds. In some ways, it's encoded into our very DNA how to survive and to succeed. And in moments of darkness, as you move forward in your lives, in moments of darkness, I hope you will think of this moment. This is a moment, I'm thinking of a long ago moment, a moment that none of us alive witnessed, but surely it happened or we would not be here. This is a moment when long, long ago, someone in all of our backgrounds had to have looked into the face of the person who had raised them. Maybe they were, at that moment, about to board a ship on the coast of Ireland or Italy or China, or about to cross the Rio Grande, or about to get on a train from Mississippi going north, the Illinois Central. But whatever it is, they had to look into the face of the person who had raised them. And they had to wonder if they would ever see them alive again. And the person who had raised them, this mother, this father, this uncle, this grandparent, grandmother, grandfather, whoever that person was, who could not make the journey with them, had to look into the face of that young person, knowing that they could not make the crossing themselves, and wonder, will they ever see this person alive again? Remember, there was no Skype. There was no email. There were no cell phones. There was not even reliable long-distance service. So that meant that truly this was a parting that was momentous, that was a great break in an entire family line. And it was necessary for that to happen. That heartbreaking moment had to happen for us to even be here at this moment today. Perhaps as they boarded that boat, perhaps as they boarded that train, they hoped that many, many decades later, many generations later, while they might not have ever made it to college, while they might never ever have been able to stand and walk in a line and receive a diploma, perhaps their great, great, great grandchild would, that they would never see. And so I want us to think about that moment as we go forward. And that gives us an urgency to make our lives worth something, to recognize that if they could do all that they did with absolutely nothing, then there's nothing that we can't do, and we owe it to them and we owe it to ourselves to make the most of what they have sacrificed for us. I want to leave you with the words of Richard Wright, who was the inspiration in some ways for, well, absolutely the inspiration for the title of the book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And he was the bard of the Great Migration. He was someone, one of the great novelists of the 20th century, and he wrote, almost everything he wrote, from Native Son to all of his nonfiction, was an attempt to understand this great movement and wave of people that had changed the North and the South. But also what he wrote was he wrote these words as he was about to leave Mississippi for Chicago, from the only place he'd ever known to a place he'd never seen in hopes that life might be better, jumping off a cliff with no guarantees. It is a message for anyone, a message for any immigrant, a message for anyone on the cusp of a new day. And this is what he wrote. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. When I finished the book, I was so relieved because I had actually achieved this goal. A lot of people wondered would I ever finish it, and I did. And so therefore, I am graduating with you and celebrating with you because this is my achievement of the last few years. As you graduate, so do I. And the timing is perfect. And once the book came out, a wise person said to me, the most important readers of your book have not been born yet. And I thought it was one of the highest forms of praise I could ever receive. You will be teaching them. You will be teaching them. And so my wish for you, my prayer for you, is that your path be clear and wondrous. May the sun warm your path, and may the sun protect you on your journey. Thank you and congratulations.